This woman called 911 9 times in 1 hour. 9 calls, each one more hysterical than the last. Each one painting me as a violent criminal threatening her precious son. By the time the patrol cars arrived, she had constructed an elaborate fiction that should have landed me in handcuffs. Instead, those 9 recorded calls would become the foundation of her own destruction. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. From that sweltering Saturday afternoon when I first learned that Pleasantdale Estates was not the peaceful retirement I had been promised. Comment below where you are watching from. My name is Garrett Mitchell, 44 years old. I spent 22 years as a law enforcement officer, the last 8 as police chief of Monroe County, before retiring 3 days ago to this quiet suburban neighborhood. That Saturday started simple enough. I needed groceries, so I drove to the Kroger about 10 minutes from my new house. The store was packed with weekend shoppers, families loading carts, nothing out of the ordinary. I grabbed what I needed, paid at the register, and pushed my cart toward my car, parked near the back of the lot. The heat was brutal, easily 95 degrees, and I was thinking about nothing more than getting home and enjoying a cold drink on my porch. That was when I noticed him watching me from across the parking lot, leaning against a black pickup truck with the kind of relaxed arrogance that comes from never facing consequences. He was young, maybe 24, with the overdeveloped build of someone who treats the gym like a second job and actual work like a foreign concept. As I approached my car, he pushed off from his truck and walked directly into my path, blocking me with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "You're the new guy on Maple Court, right? The one who bought the Henderson place." I confirmed that I had recently moved in, keeping my voice neutral, my hands visible on the cart handle. His smile widened into something predatory. "Well then, welcome to Pleasantdale. I'm Bryce Whitmore. My mom runs this neighborhood, and we have certain traditions around here." He stepped closer, deliberately invading my space. "See, when new people want to enjoy the amenities of our community, including shopping at our local stores, there's a tax. Consider it a welcome fee." He gestured at my groceries. "Hand them over, and we'll call it even for your first month." I kept my expression flat, my breathing steady. Every instinct I had developed over 2 decades told me exactly what this was. A setup, a provocation designed to generate a reaction he could exploit. I told him calmly that I would not be handing over anything and suggested he step aside. His expression flickered with genuine surprise, as if he had never heard the word no before, and then he pulled out his phone and started recording. "Oh, you want to play it like that? Old man, fine. Go ahead. Hit me. I dare you. Hit me and see what happens." He held the phone inches from my face, angling for the perfect shot of the aggressive newcomer attacking an innocent local. I did not move. I did not raise my voice. I simply repeated my request for him to step aside. That was when he lunged forward, grabbed one of my grocery bags, and shoved me hard in the chest. I stumbled backward against a parked car as oranges scattered across the hot asphalt. He kept recording, narrating for his invisible audience. "You see that? You see how he came at me?" And then, right on cue, his mother appeared. I caught the detail that confirmed my suspicions. She emerged from a silver SUV parked just 2 rows over, close enough to have watched the entire exchange. Phone already pressed to her ear before she even reached us. This was not a coincidence. This was choreographed. "Oh my God! Bryce, baby! Are you okay?" She threw herself between us, positioning her body as a shield against a threat that did not exist. Into her phone, she screamed with theatrical precision. "Yes, 911. I need help immediately. A man is attacking my son in the Kroger parking lot. He's dangerous. Please send someone right away." Her tears appeared on command. Her voice trembled at exactly the right moments. But when she glanced at me between sobs, I saw the truth behind the performance. Cold calculation. This was not panic. This was warfare. Over the next 45 minutes, she made 8 more calls to 911, each one adding new fabrications to her story. By the time 2 patrol cars arrived, I had allegedly threatened her son with violence, used slurs, and attempted to steal from his vehicle. The officers separated us and took statements. I provided my identification, including my retired credentials, and explained what had actually occurred. There were no injuries, no corroborating witnesses, no evidence of any crime on my part. The senior officer pulled me aside before leaving. "Mr. Mitchell, I want you to know we're documenting the volume of these calls. 911 calls for a situation with no actual emergency raise flags in our system. Nothing actionable today, but it's on record." I thanked him and watched the patrol cars pull away as I gathered my scattered groceries from the pavement. Sandra Whitmore approached me one final time. The tears had evaporated. The trembling voice was gone. In their place was a smile that belonged on a predator. "Welcome to Pleasantdale, Mr. Mitchell. I'm Sandra Whitmore, president of the Homeowners Association. I've held that position for 8 years now. I know everyone in this community. I know everything that happens here." She paused, letting the implication settle. "I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot of each other." She turned and walked away, Bryce trailing behind with a smirk that promised this was far from over. I drove home in silence, my mind cataloging every detail, every word, every calculated gesture. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed the red flag raised on my mailbox. Inside was a single envelope stamped with the Pleasantdale Estates HOA logo. The timestamp on the violation notice read 2:15 p.m., more than an hour before the incident at Kroger had even begun. Improper placement of a garbage receptacle. Fine $75. I had not unpacked my garbage cans yet. Sandra Whitmore had prepared this notice before her son ever blocked my path. The trap had been set long before I walked into it. The first violation notice had been suspicious enough, time-stamped before the Kroger incident even occurred. What arrived in my mailbox the next morning made it clear Sandra Whitmore was not interested in warning shots. She wanted total war. I walked out at 7:30 a.m., still holding my coffee, and found the mailbox stuffed with envelopes. 7 of them, each bearing the Pleasantdale Estates HOA logo, each stamped with red ink reading "Violation Notice." I spread them across my kitchen table and began to read. What I discovered over the next 30 minutes would have been comical if it had not been so clearly malicious. Violation 2, grass exceeding the maximum height of 3 inches. Fine $150. My lawn had been professionally cut the day before I moved in. Violation 3, vehicle parked on street for more than 6 consecutive hours. Fine $100. My car had not left the garage since Kroger. Violation, poor door paint color, not matching the approved palette. Fine $200. The previous owners had that color approved by the HOA 6 months ago, documented in my closing paperwork. Violation 5, excessive noise after 10 p.m. Fine $125. I had been asleep by 9 every night since moving in. Violation 6, unregistered pet on premises. Fine $175. I owned no pets. Violation 7, unauthorized decorative item in front yard, specifically a potted plant. Fine $100. The plant came with the house, sitting in the same spot for years. Violation 8, guest parking violation. Fine $150. I had not received a single visitor since moving in. Total fines $1,075 in 24 hours for violations that either did not exist or were fabricated entirely. I pulled out the HOA covenant documents and spent 2 hours cross-referencing every accusation. 3 violations referenced covenant sections that did not exist. 2 cited rules with specific exceptions are clearly applicable to my situation. The remaining 3 were simply lies. This was not enforcement. This was punishment. I drove to the HOA management office near the subdivision entrance. The receptionist smiled and asked how she could help. I requested to speak with the president regarding my violation notices. Her smile tightened. "Mrs. Whitmore is very busy, but let me check." She disappeared into a back office, and less than a minute later, Sandra Whitmore emerged in a pastel yellow dress, her expression arranged into practiced concern. "Mr. Mitchell, what a pleasant surprise. I heard there might have been some confusion about your welcome to our community." I placed the 8 notices on the counter and explained that each accusation was either false or based on non-existent regulations. I requested immediate dismissal, pending investigation. Sandra picked up the notices, flipped through them with theatrical thoughtfulness, and set them down. "Our violation process is thorough, Mr. Mitchell. Each of these was documented by our compliance officer with photographic evidence. I asked to see that evidence. Submit a written appeal. Our office will process it within 90 business days, as outlined in Article 14, Section 3. 90 business days. More than 4 months to review accusations she knew were fraudulent the moment she signed them. I asked about the appeals committee. They meet quarterly. You just missed our summer session. The next meeting is in March. She let that settle before continuing. The fines are due within 30 days. Failure to pay results in late fees and, eventually, a lien on your property. She handed the notices back, her fingers brushing mine. I hope we can move past this unpleasantness. Pleasantdale is wonderful when everyone follows the rules. I left without another word. There was nothing to gain from arguing with someone who had written the rules specifically to ensure no one could win against her. Back home, I began documenting everything systematically. Photographs of my property from every angle with timestamps. The violation notices are filed in folders. A detailed log of every interaction, every word spoken, every date and time recorded. That evening, I knocked on the door of the house directly across the street. According to my research, the owner was Raymond Burke, 62 years old, a retired accountant, resident of Pleasantdale for over a decade. The door opened halfway, and a thin man with gray hair looked at me with obvious apprehension. I introduced myself as his new neighbor and mentioned I was having issues with HOA notices. His eyes flicked past me toward Sandra Whitmore's house at the end of the block. Then he stepped aside and gestured me in, closing the door behind us. I know exactly why you're here, Mr. Mitchell, and he led me into a living room where the curtains were already drawn. You're not the first person Sandra has targeted. You're the 6th in 3 years. He sat down in an armchair, his hands clasped tightly together. The other 5 all sold their homes and left within months of getting their first violation notice. They couldn't take the pressure, the fines, the constant harassment. Sandra knows how to make people feel like they have no options. He paused, studying my face as if measuring whether I could handle what came next. But there was one man who refused to leave. His name was Doug Mercer, IT engineer, stubborn as hell. He decided he was going to fight back, document everything, and expose her corruption. Raymond's voice dropped. One night, all 4 of his tires were slashed. No witnesses, no proof, but everyone knew. He met my eyes directly for the first time. Doug sold his house 2 months later. He never spoke to anyone in the neighborhood again. I asked Raymond how long this had been going on. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. 8 years. Sandra has been president for 8 years. No one runs against her anymore. No one even attends the HOA meetings except her supporters. She controls the budget, the fines, the appeals process, everything. He leaned forward slightly. I was fined $4,500 2 years ago for having the wrong shade of paint on my shutters. I paid it. I didn't fight, because I saw what happened to the people who did. I thanked him for the information and stood to leave. At the door, he grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. Mr. Mitchell, I don't know what you're planning, but whatever you do, don't underestimate her, and don't assume anyone will help you. He released my arm and opened the door just wide enough for me to slip out. The last person who thought he could beat Sandra Whitmore ended up with more than flat tires. He ended up with nothing. And Raymond Burke's warning stayed with me that night. 6 people in 3 years. 5 fled without a fight. 1 tried to resist and lost everything anyway. The pattern was obvious. And Sandra Whitmore had perfected it over 8 years of unchallenged authority. But sitting in my living room, staring at the stack of fraudulent violations on my coffee table, I saw what Raymond and Doug Mercer and all the others had apparently missed. They tried to fight Sandra using her system. Her rules, her timeline, her appeals process was designed specifically to exhaust and bankrupt anyone who challenged her. I was not going to make that mistake. 2 decades of building cases against people who believed they were untouchable had taught me a single methodology that never failed. Document everything. Build the evidence. Wait for them to make a mistake. Then strike when they least expect it. The next morning, I assessed my property's security infrastructure. The basic system I installed when I purchased the house provided coverage of the front door, back door, garage entrance, and side yard. 4 cameras, 270 degrees of total coverage, footage stored on a cloud server for 30 days. It was adequate for a normal neighborhood. Pleasantdale was clearly not a normal neighborhood. I drove to an electronics store 40 minutes outside the subdivision, paying cash for 2 additional cameras designed to blend into exterior fixtures. I positioned one within a decorative porch light to capture the entire street in front of my house. The other I concealed in the eaves above the garage, angled to record anyone approaching my driveway. Both units tested, both verified for cloud backup, both sharp enough to identify faces in low light conditions. If anyone came onto my property with hostile intent, I would have evidence that could hold up in any courtroom. That afternoon, I called Frank Holloway. We had known each other since high school, lost touch during my law enforcement years, and reconnected at a mutual friend's funeral 5 years ago. Frank had built a successful practice specializing in real estate law and HOA disputes, which made him exactly the person I needed right now. He answered on the third ring, surprised to hear from me, but pleased nonetheless. I walked him through everything without embellishment. The Kroger incident, the 8 violation notices, my conversation with Raymond Burke, my suspicions about Sandra Whitmore's pattern of targeted harassment. Frank listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification on specific points. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment before responding. Garrett, what you're describing is textbook HOA abuse, but proving it in court requires 3 things. He laid them out directly. First, demonstrate that the violations were issued in breach of the covenant's own procedures. Second, prove the targeting was retaliatory rather than uniform enforcement. Third, document measurable financial or property damages as a result. Frank continued with a context that shifted my approach. There's another angle here. If the HOA president is using her position for personal vendettas, that's a civil matter. But if there's criminal activity involved, property destruction, fraud, intimidation, then you pursue both tracks simultaneously. Civil lawsuit against the HOA, criminal charges against the individuals responsible. I asked what evidence would be required for the criminal angle. Proof of specific illegal acts. Victim testimony helps, but isn't sufficient alone. What you need is documentation so comprehensive that when you present it to law enforcement, they have no choice but to act. He paused before adding one final piece of counsel. Whatever you do, don't confront them directly. Don't threaten. Don't retaliate. Let them think they're winning. The moment they believe you've given up is the moment they get careless. That's when they expose themselves. I spent the rest of that day constructing my documentation system with the same discipline I had applied to criminal investigations throughout my career. A detailed spreadsheet logging every violation notice with its date, accusation, fine amount, and cited covenant section. Adjacent columns noting whether that section actually existed in the covenant, whether the accusation was factually accurate, and what evidence I possessed to disprove it. I photographed my property from every angle with timestamps embedded in the metadata. I scanned every document related to my home purchase, the previous owner's approved paint colors, landscaping specifications, HOA compliance certifications, everything. Backups are created on 2 separate hard drives. Everything is mirrored to a secure cloud server. By evening, I had the foundation of a case file any prosecutor would recognize as professional-grade work. The next step was establishing that I was not Sandra Whitmore's only victim. Raymond had mentioned 5 other residents driven out before me. If I could document their experiences, isolated incidents would transform into evidence of systematic abuse. I visited Raymond the following morning and asked if he would provide a written statement about his own experiences with Sandra and the HOA. He agreed, though not without hesitation. He described the $4,500 fine, the months of harassment that preceded it, and watching his property value decline as word spread about Pleasantdale's true nature. When he finished, I asked if he knew how to contact any of the previous victims. He provided 2 names, former neighbors who had left contact information before fleeing the subdivision. I thanked him and promised to keep his involvement confidential for as long as possible. That night, I reviewed my camera footage as part of my new evening routine. The first 3 nights had shown nothing unusual, just occasional cars passing, a neighbor walking a dog, the ordinary rhythm of suburban life after dark. But on the 4th night, motion sensors triggered the street-facing camera at 2:17 a.m. I pulled up the footage. A figure in a dark hoodie walked slowly past my house. He paused at the edge of my driveway, turned to face my property, and stood motionless for nearly 30 seconds. Then he continued down the street. 12 minutes later, he returned. Same slow pace, same pause at my driveway, same in-a-home extended stare. At 2:41 a.m., he made a 3rd pass. This time, when he stopped, he looked directly at where my front door camera was mounted, counting, measuring, calculating. In the pale glow of the streetlight, I could see what he held in his right hand, a knife. I watched the footage 7 times that morning. The gait was distinctive, that same swagger from the Kroger parking lot. The build matched, On the third pass, when he turned toward my camera, the streetlight caught his face long enough for identification. Bryce Whitmore. 3 consecutive nights of surveillance, each visit longer than the last, each pass more deliberate. The knife in his hand on the final night was a fixed-blade hunting knife, not decorative. I downloaded the footage to 3 separate locations. Timestamp preserved, metadata intact. Whatever came next, I had documented evidence of premeditation. I needed facts, not neighborhood gossip. I picked up my phone and called Sergeant Diana Cole. She answered on the second ring. "Garrett Mitchell, heard you finally retired. What's it been?" 3 months. Diana had served under my command for 6 years before transferring to the county sheriff's department. Sharp, thorough, reliable. I explained that I had moved to Pleasantdale Estates and encountered concerning behavior from a resident named Bryce Whitmore. The Kroger incident, the HOA harassment, the surveillance footage. Diana listened without interrupting. When I finished, her tone shifted from friendly to professional. "Bryce Whitmore, that name sounds familiar. Give me a couple of hours, but you know I can't share anything from sealed records." I told her I understood. 2 hours and 17 minutes later, she called back. Her voice was careful, measured. "Garrett, I can't give you specifics from official records, but Bryce Whitmore has a history with law enforcement in this county. Multiple contacts over several years." I asked if any involved violent behavior. A long pause. "I would recommend good security cameras and documenting everything. That's all I can say." The call ended. What Diana could not tell me, public records could. I spent the next 4 hours conducting research I had done hundreds of times during my career. Court records, local news archives, property transactions. The picture that emerged was worse than anticipated. Bryce Whitmore had been arrested 3 times in 6 years. 2019, petty theft from a hardware store, dismissed when the owner declined to press charges. 2020, vandalism after allegedly keying multiple vehicles in a restaurant parking lot, dropped due to insufficient evidence despite multiple witnesses. 2021, assault at a downtown bar, reached preliminary hearing, collapsed when the victim refused to testify. 3 arrests, 3 dismissals. Each offense is more serious than the last. I dug deeper into the assault case. A county newspaper article provided the details. A 21-year-old man was hospitalized after an altercation. Witnesses identified Bryce as the attacker. The victim initially cooperated, gave a statement, and agreed to testify. 6 weeks before trial, he withdrew cooperation entirely. The prosecutor expressed frustration at the dismissal, almost as an aside. The article mentioned that the victim had recently sold his home in Pleasantdale Estates and relocated out of state. Petty theft victim declines to press charges. Vandalism witnesses become unavailable. Assault victim sells his house and disappears before trial. Sandra Whitmore had held the HOA presidency for 8 years. Her son had been arrested 3 times in 6 years. Every victim either backed down or moved away. I thought about Doug Mercer, who refused to leave after his tires were slashed. He sold his house 2 months later and never spoke to anyone in the neighborhood again. I thought about the 5 residents Raymond mentioned, all driven out within months of their first violation notice. The HOA was not just a vehicle for petty harassment. It was leverage. I visited Raymond that evening and shared the public record findings. He nodded slowly, unsurprised. "There's something else you should know," he said quietly. "There's been talk for years about where Sandra gets money for Bryce's lawyers. Those defense attorneys don't come cheap. Sandra's never held a job outside the HOA." He leaned forward. "People whispered that she's been dipping into the HOA treasury. Maintenance fees go up every year. But actual maintenance has gotten worse. Nobody knows where the money goes because nobody's demanded an audit." I asked if he had documentation. He shook his head. "Just rumors. But if someone formally requested the financial records under the covenant's transparency provisions, the HOA would be legally required to provide them." I filed that away. Rumors were not evidence. But financial records could become evidence very quickly. I returned home at 9:45 p.m. and checked my security system. Everything appeared normal. Then my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. 3 words, "Simply digging now." Every light in my house went dark. I moved to the window. Every other house on the block still had power. The outage was mine alone. Beneath the streetlight across from my driveway stood Bryce Whitmore, phone raised and recording. He saw me in the darkened window. He smiled and waved. The morning after Bryce cut my power, I drove 30 miles to purchase a portable generator and an uninterruptible power supply for my security cameras. Cash transaction, no receipt linking the purchase to my address. The UPS would maintain camera operation for 6 hours on battery backup, more than enough to capture whatever they attempted in darkness. I installed the equipment that afternoon and tested the failover system twice. Sandra and Bryce had made their strategy predictable. They believed cutting my power would leave me vulnerable. Instead, it prompted me to eliminate the weakness they were counting on. Raymond Burke knocked on my door that evening, glancing over his shoulder before stepping inside. He held out a USB drive without ceremony. "I told you I was an accountant for 35 years. When Sandra fined me $4,500, I started paying closer attention to the numbers. Every year at the annual meeting, the HOA distributes a financial summary. Most people throw it away. I didn't." He gestured at the drive. 5 years of financial reports, revenue, expenses, reserve fund balances. I scanned everything. I asked what he had found. Raymond shook his head. "I'm not a forensic accountant, but some numbers never made sense. Maybe they'll make sense to you." I spent the next 3 hours analyzing the data. Raymond had provided annual reports from 5 fiscal years, each containing revenue summaries, expense categories, and reserve fund statements. I built a spreadsheet cross-referencing every figure. Revenue was straightforward. Pleasant Dale Estates contained 147 homes. Each homeowner paid $350 monthly in HOA dues, increased by $25 annually for the past 4 years. Current annual revenue, $617,400. The reports matched. Expenses appeared reasonable, approximately $380,000 annually on landscaping, insurance, utilities for community facilities, administrative fees, and reserve fund contributions, consistent with industry standards for a community this size. Annual surplus approximately $237,000 over 5 years. That surplus should have accumulated to nearly $1.2 million, minus major capital expenditures. The reserve fund balance in the most recent statement, $412,000. No major capital projects in 5 years. No emergency repairs. No significant purchases. Pool not resurfaced. Roads not repaved. Clubhouse not renovated. $773,000 unaccounted for. I called Frank Holloway the next morning and walked him through my findings. He listened, asked clarifying questions about methodology, then exhaled slowly. "If your analysis is accurate, this isn't civil misconduct anymore. Embezzlement at this scale is a felony. We're talking potential prison time." I asked about next steps. "You need an official audit by a licensed forensic accountant. The problem is, under the HOA covenant, only the board can authorize an independent audit, and Sandra controls the board." His voice sharpened. "However, Article 11, Section 4 allows homeowners to petition for an independent financial review with signatures from 25% of the membership. 147 homes means 37 signatures. Submit that petition, and the board is legally required to hire an outside auditor within 60 days. Refuse, and you take them to court." He promised to draft the petition language within the hour. The document arrived 53 minutes later. I began canvassing the neighborhood that afternoon, door to door, explaining the situation to each homeowner. Some refused to answer. Others listened and declined, fear evident in their expressions. But more than I expected had their own grievances, their own stories of arbitrary fines, their own questions about where the monthly dues were going. Day 1, 8 signatures. Day 2, 23. Day 3, 35. Too short. The remaining holdouts were either known allies of Sandra or too frightened to sign anything that might draw her attention. On the 4th morning, Margaret Fielding called, 72 years old, lived alone at the far end of the subdivision. "Mr. Mitchell, I heard you're collecting signatures. I'd like to add my name." I drove to her house within the hour. She met me at the door, a small woman with silver hair and steady eyes. As she signed, she spoke in a matter-of-fact tone. "Last year, my cat disappeared. 3 days later, I found her in my backyard, throat cut." She set down the pen. Everyone knew it was Bryce. He told the teenagers on the next block. When I called the police, Sandra appeared at my door within an hour. She said if I pursued it, I would regret it for the rest of my life. Margaret looked up, I'm 72. I'd like to spend whatever time I have left watching that woman answer for what she's done. The 37th signature came from Kevin Marsh, 29, who had moved to Pleasantdale 2 years earlier. I've been waiting for someone to stand up to her. I just didn't want to be first. I prepared the petition package. 37 signatures. Notarized copies of financial discrepancies. A formal cover letter demanding compliance with Article 11. Section 4. I delivered the package to the HOA office at 3:15 p.m. and obtained a time-stamped receipt. The receptionist said Sandra was attending an out-of-state conference, returning in 3 days, 60 days to produce an independent audit, or face legal action. I returned home at 4:30 p.m. At 2:23 a.m., motion sensors triggered my driveway camera. I pulled up the live feed. Bryce Whitmore approached my vehicle with a hunting knife. He moved without hurry, almost casually. One tire was punctured with a deliberate thrust. Then the second, third, fourth. When he finished, he turned to face my garage camera directly, held up the knife, smiled, raised his middle finger, then walked into the darkness. Timestamp verified. Face visible. Footage uploading to a server he would never reach. I called 911 at 6:14 a.m., 3 hours and 51 minutes after Bryce Whitmore slashed my tires. The dispatcher took my report calmly, noting the details I provided. Vandalism, property damage, suspect identified, video evidence available. A patrol unit would be dispatched within the hour. I made coffee while I waited, watching the sunrise through my kitchen window, thinking about the footage uploading silently to a cloud server in a data center 3 states away. Bryce had smiled at my camera. He had raised his middle finger in triumph. He had no idea that his moment of arrogance had just handed me everything I needed to destroy him. Sergeant Diana Cole arrived at 7:45 a.m., earlier than I expected, and in an unmarked vehicle rather than a patrol car. She stepped out and surveyed my vehicle in the driveway, walking a slow circle around the 4 flattened tires, photographing the damage from multiple angles. "When you called dispatch, they flagged it for me," she said without looking up. "Figured you'd want someone who understands the full picture." I invited her inside and showed her the footage on my laptop. She watched in silence as Bryce approached the vehicle, knife in hand, and methodically punctured each tire. When he turned to the camera and smiled, Diana paused the playback and studied his face. "That's clear enough for any jury in the country. Felony vandalism, property damage exceeding $1,000. With his prior record, he's looking at 1 to 3 years. She asked if I wanted to press charges. I told her I wanted more than charges. I wanted the full picture. Diana listened as I explained the broader pattern. The Kroger incident, the 9911 calls, the fraudulent HOA violations, the missing $773,000, the intimidation campaign against previous residents, Margaret Fielding's cat, Doug Mercer's tires, and subsequent flight from the neighborhood. Diana took notes throughout, her expression growing more serious with each revelation. When I finished, she closed her notebook and looked at me directly. "Garrett, what you're describing is a potential RICO case, coordinated criminal activity using the HOA as a front. That's beyond my authority to investigate, but I can start building the foundation." She explained that the 911 calls from the Kroger incident were recorded and archived. Under the Freedom of Information Act, I could request copies of those recordings. If Sandra's statements to the dispatcher contradicted the physical evidence, that was filing a false police report, a Class 1 misdemeanor that could carry up to 12 months in jail and a $2,500 fine. I asked how to submit the request. Diana provided the form and told me to expect a response within 5 to 7 business days. I filed the FOIA request that afternoon, specifying the date, time, and location of the incident, along with Sandra Whitmore's name as the caller. 5 days later, a manila envelope arrived in my mailbox containing a USB drive and a cover letter from the county records office. 9 audio files, 9 911 calls. I listened to each one in sequence, taking detailed notes on every statement Sandra made. The first call established her narrative. A man is attacking her son. Threats of violence, racial slurs, attempted theft. Each subsequent call added layers of fabrication. By the 9th call, Sandra had constructed an elaborate fiction in which I had brandished a weapon, made death threats, and physically assaulted Bryce in front of multiple witnesses. The recordings captured every word, every calculated sob, every manufactured detail. I drove to the Kroger that afternoon and spoke with the store manager, explaining that I was gathering evidence for a legal matter and requesting access to their parking lot security footage from the date in question. The manager was hesitant until I mentioned that the alternative was a subpoena. 20 minutes later, I had a copy of the footage on another USB drive. That evening, I synchronized the 911 audio with the security video, creating a side-by-side comparison that demolished Sandra's story completely. At the moment she told the dispatcher I was attacking her son, the video showed Bryce grabbing my grocery bag and shoving me backward. When she claimed I was using racial slurs, the video showed me standing motionless with my hands visible at my sides. When she described me brandishing a weapon, the video showed my empty hands while Bryce held his phone inches from my face. 9 lies, 9 recorded lies. Each one is a separate count of filing a false police report. I called Frank Holloway and played him the synchronized evidence over the phone. He was silent for a long moment after the playback ended. "Garrett, you've got them." Sandra Whitmore is looking at 9 counts of filing a false police report, which could be consolidated or charged separately, depending on the prosecutor's approach. Bryce is facing felony vandalism with prior offenses, plus potential stalking charges based on your surveillance footage of his nighttime visits. If we can prove they coordinated their actions, and the evidence strongly suggests they did, we can add conspiracy charges. He paused. But here's my advice. Don't move yet. The annual HOA meeting is scheduled for next week. Sandra will be there. Every homeowner will be there. If you're going to take her down, do it publicly. Let the community see exactly who they've been paying dues to for 8 years. 3 days before the meeting, my phone rang from an unknown number. I answered and activated the recording app I had installed after Bryce's text message. Sandra Whitmore's voice came through the speaker, smooth and pleasant, as if we were old friends. "Mr. Mitchell, I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot. I'd like to propose a resolution that benefits everyone." I asked what she had in mind. "You're a reasonable man, a former law enforcement professional. You understand that sometimes conflicts escalate beyond what anyone intended. I'm prepared to offer you $50,000 to withdraw your audit petition and relocate to a community better suited to your needs. No hard feelings, just a fresh start somewhere else." I asked her to repeat the amount. $50,000, Mr. Mitchell, cash, untraceable. All you have to do is sign a simple agreement and move on with your life. I let the silence stretch for 5 seconds before responding. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you offering me money to drop a legal matter and leave the community?" Her laugh was light, dismissive. "I'm offering you a generous settlement to avoid unnecessary unpleasantness. Surely a man of your experience can appreciate the value of a clean resolution." I told her I would consider her offer and ended the call. The recording was 3 minutes and 47 seconds long. Clear audio. Her voice is unmistakable. A textbook case of attempted bribery. A felony carrying 1 to 5 years in state prison. I added the file to my evidence folder and began preparing my presentation for the annual meeting. The night before the meeting, I received an email from the county sheriff's office. Diana Cole had submitted her report on the vandalism incident, recommending charges against Bryce Whitmore. An arrest warrant was being processed and would likely be executed within 48 to 72 hours. I replied with a single question: could the timing of the arrest be coordinated with a specific public event? Diana's response came 20 minutes later. "I'll see what I can do." I set my alarm for 5 a.m., laid out my documentation in the order I would present it, and reviewed my notes one final time. 8 years of Sandra Whitmore's reign were about to end, and she had no idea what was coming. The annual HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. at the Pleasantdale Community Center, a modest building adjacent to the subdivision's pool and tennis courts. I arrived at 6:30, carrying a leather messenger bag containing every piece of documentation I had assembled over the previous weeks. The parking lot was already filling, more vehicles than Raymond said he had ever seen at an HOA function. Word had spread about the audit petition. Word had spread about the confrontation brewing between the new resident and the woman who had ruled this neighborhood for 8 years. People wanted to witness what happened next. I found a seat in the 3rd row, positioned where I could observe both the front podium and the entrance doors. The room filled steadily around me. By 7 p.m., 89 residents had taken their seats, the largest attendance in Pleasantdale HOA history, according to the sign-in sheet near the door. Sandra Whitmore entered at exactly 7 p.m., dressed in a cream-colored blazer and pearls. her hair perfectly styled, her smile radiating the practiced warmth of a woman accustomed to controlling every room she entered. Bryce was notably absent. She took her position at the podium and welcomed everyone with the ease of someone who had delivered this performance dozens of times before. Thank you all for coming tonight. It's wonderful to see such community engagement. This past year has been another successful chapter in Pleasantdale's history, and I'm excited to share our accomplishments with you. She launched into a prepared presentation about landscaping improvements, insurance negotiations, and reserve fund projections. Her voice was smooth, confident, utterly in command. She had no idea what was about to happen. 15 minutes into her presentation, I raised my hand. Sandra's eyes flickered toward me, her smile tightening almost imperceptibly. Mr. Mitchell, questions are reserved for the end of the formal presentation. I stood up, keeping my voice calm and measured. Under Article 8, Section 2 of the HOA Covenant, any resident who has obtained signatures from 25% of the membership may introduce a matter for immediate discussion before the General Assembly. I held up the petition folder. I have 37 signatures, representing 25.2% of Pleasantdale homeowners, requesting that this meeting address concerns about HOA financial management. A murmur rippled through the audience. Sandra's smile did not waver, but something shifted behind her eyes. I see. Well, procedurally speaking, I suppose we can accommodate a brief discussion. What specific concerns would you like to raise? I walked to the front of the room and distributed printed copies of my financial analysis to the residents in the front rows, asking them to pass the documents back. Over the past 5 fiscal years, Pleasantdale Estates has collected approximately $3,087,000 in homeowner dues. Operating expenses during that period totaled approximately $1,900,000. According to standard accounting practices, our reserve fund should contain approximately $1.2 million. I paused, letting the numbers settle. The current reported reserve fund balance is $412,000. There have been no major capital expenditures during this period, no emergency repairs, no significant equipment purchases. I looked directly at Sandra. $773,000 is unaccounted for. The murmur in the audience grew louder. Raymond Burke stood up from his seat in the second row. I was a certified public accountant for 35 years. I've reviewed these figures independently. The discrepancy Mr. Mitchell has identified is accurate. This money did not go to community maintenance or improvements. It went somewhere else. Sandra's composure cracked for the first time. These are baseless accusations from disgruntled residents who don't understand complex financial management. The funds in question were allocated to various administrative expenses, legal fees, insurance adjustments. I interrupted her. Legal fees? That's interesting. The 2020-21 financial report shows a line item of $47,500 for legal services. I held up the document. That same year, your son Bryce was arrested for assault. The charges were dropped when the victim, a Pleasantdale resident named Doug Mercer, suddenly refused to testify and moved out of state. Can you explain why the HOA was paying legal fees that coincide exactly with your son's criminal defense? The room went silent. Sandra's face flushed red. How dare you? How dare you bring my family into this? My son has nothing to do with HOA finances. A woman in the back row spoke up. Then why did my dues go up $50 last year, while the pool hasn't been cleaned properly in months? Another voice joined in. My neighbor got fined $300 for a mailbox that was supposedly the wrong shade of black. Meanwhile, the streetlights on Elm Court have been out for 6 months. The complaints cascaded through the room, years of accumulated resentment finally finding an outlet. Sandra gripped the podium, her knuckles white, her carefully constructed persona crumbling in real time. That was when the doors at the back of the community center opened. Sergeant Diana Cole walked in, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. The room fell silent as they made their way down the center aisle toward the podium. Diana's expression was professionally neutral as she stopped in front of Sandra Whitmore. Mrs. Whitmore, I need to inform you that your son, Bryce Whitmore, was taken into custody approximately 30 minutes ago on charges of felony vandalism, criminal mischief, and stalking. Sandra's face went pale. What? That's impossible. You can't, Diana continued without pause. Additionally, Mrs. Whitmore, you are under arrest for filing a false police report. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. What happened next would be discussed in Pleasantdale for years to come. Sandra Whitmore, 8-year president of the Homeowners Association, pillar of the community, controller of every neighborhood decision, completely lost control. "You can't do this to me!" she screamed, backing away from Diana. "I know the mayor. I know the county commissioner. I'll have your badge. Do you have any idea who I am?" Diana remained motionless, waiting. Sandra spun toward the audience, her finger stabbing toward me. "This is his fault. He's been harassing me since he moved here. He's the criminal, not my son." She turned back to Diana, her voice rising to a shriek. "I've gotten rid of people like him before. Dozens of them. They all left. They all gave up. No one fights me in this neighborhood. I own this community. I decide who stays and who goes." The room was absolutely still. 89 residents stared at the woman they had paid dues to for 8 years. The woman who had smiled at their children and complimented their gardens, while systematically draining their treasury and driving out anyone who questioned her authority. Diana Cole spoke into the silence. "Thank you for that statement, Mrs. Whitmore. It will be included in my report." She nodded to the uniformed officers, who moved forward and placed Sandra in handcuffs. Sandra continued screaming as they led her toward the exit, threats and accusations echoing off the community center walls. At the doorway, she twisted around for one final look at the assembled residents. "You'll regret this, all of you. This isn't over." Then she was gone. I stood at the podium, facing a room full of stunned homeowners. Under Article 12, Section 1 of the HOA Covenant, when the president is unable to fulfill their duties, the vice president assumes temporary authority until a special election can be held. I paused. "I move that we schedule a new election within 30 days to select leadership that actually serves this community's interests." The motion passed unanimously as residents began filing out, still processing what they had witnessed. An elderly man in the back row stood up slowly, Harold Finch, according to his name tag. His hands were trembling. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, his voice cracking, "I need to talk to you about Bryce, about something that happened in 2019. He swallowed hard. "Something I should have reported a long time ago." The weeks following the HOA meeting brought a cascade of legal consequences that Sandra Whitmore never anticipated. Harold Finch's testimony proved to be the first of several dominoes. The elderly man described an incident from 2019 in which Bryce had cornered him in his own garage and threatened to burn his house down if he reported a property dispute to authorities. Harold had stayed silent for 6 years, terrified of retaliation. After watching Sandra being dragged out of the community center in handcuffs, he finally found the courage to speak. 2 other former victims came forward within the following week. One had relocated to Arizona after Bryce vandalized her vehicle. Another had settled quietly with Sandra after receiving months of threatening letters disguised as HOA correspondence. Their testimonies reopened cases that prosecutors had previously been forced to abandon. The independent audit I had petitioned for was completed in 47 days, 12 days ahead of the legal deadline. The forensic accountant's findings exceeded even my estimates. Of the $773,000 missing from HOA accounts, the audit confirmed that $127,000 had been directly embezzled by Sandra Whitmore through fraudulent expense claims and unauthorized transfers. $47,500 had been paid to criminal defense attorneys for Bryce's various legal matters, disguised as community legal fees. $35,000 had been categorized as conference expenses, but actually funded personal vacations to resort destinations. Another $44,500 was listed as special maintenance projects for which no invoices, contracts, or completed work could be documented. The remaining discrepancies were attributed to years of inflated vendor payments and phantom services that the accountant could not fully trace without additional investigation. Bryce Whitmore's legal situation deteriorated rapidly once prosecutors assembled the complete picture. The felony vandalism charge from my vehicle carried a potential sentence of 1 to 3 years. The stalking charges based on my surveillance footage added another year. When Harold Finch and the other victims provided their statements, prosecutors added 2 counts of criminal intimidation and reopened the 2021 assault case that had collapsed when Doug Mercer fled the state. Facing a potential sentence of 8 to 12 years, If convicted on all counts, Bryce accepted a plea agreement. 4 years in state prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. He was transported to a correctional facility 90 miles from Pleasantdale before the end of the month. Sandra chose a different path. She rejected every plea offer, insisted on her innocence, and demanded a jury trial. Her defense attorney argued that the financial irregularities were accounting errors, that the 911 calls were made in genuine fear, and that the bribery recording had been manipulated or taken out of context. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts, filing 9 false police reports, attempted bribery of a witness, embezzlement of HOA funds. The judge sentenced her to 6 years in state prison and ordered full restitution of $127,000 to the Pleasantdale Estate's treasury. Sandra screamed at the judge, at the jury, at me sitting in the gallery, until bailiffs physically removed her from the courtroom. Her husband filed for divorce before she completed her first month of incarceration. The local newspaper covered the sentencing with a front-page headline that spread across the county. Longtime HOA president sentenced to prison for embezzlement and fraud. The article detailed Sandra's 8-year reign over Pleasantdale, the pattern of intimidation against residents who challenged her authority, and the courage of the homeowners who finally demanded accountability. My name appeared twice, identified only as the retired law enforcement officer who had organized the petition and gathered evidence. I declined requests for interviews. The evidence had spoken loudly enough. Doug Mercer called me 3 days after Sandra's sentencing. I had never met him, knew him only as the man who had tried to fight back and lost. His voice was thick with emotion as he thanked me for finishing what he could not. He told me that watching the news coverage had given him something he thought he had lost permanently: closure. Raymond Burke was elected HOA president in the special election, running unopposed. His first official act was to reduce monthly dues by $50 and commission a comprehensive review of all violation notices issued during Sandra's tenure. 112 fines were subsequently rescinded as improperly documented or retaliatory. Refund checks were mailed to affected residents within 60 days. The evening after Sandra's sentencing, I found an envelope in my mailbox bearing the county sheriff's department seal. Inside was a letter from the office of the county sheriff. They had followed the Pleasantdale case with interest. The county was seeking a part-time community security advisor. Given my background and demonstrated commitment to procedural justice, would I be interested in discussing the position? 6 months had passed since Sandra Whitmore was led out of the Pleasantdale Community Center in handcuffs. Spring had arrived, bringing warm breezes and blooming dogwoods that lined the subdivision's main entrance. I stood at the corner of Maple Court and Pleasantdale Drive on a Saturday morning, watching a work crew remove the large wooden sign that had greeted residents and visitors for over a decade. The old sign bore the community name in elegant gold lettering, with a smaller plaque beneath it that read, Sandra Whitmore, President. That plaque had been there so long that the wood underneath had faded to a different shade, a physical reminder of how thoroughly one person had stamped her identity onto this neighborhood. Raymond Burke stood beside me, hands in his pockets, watching the workers with quiet satisfaction. I never thought I'd see that sign come down, he said. For 8 years, driving past it felt like a reminder that we were living in her territory, not our own homes. The workers lowered the old sign carefully and set it aside. In its place, they raised a new one, freshly painted in warm colors that caught the morning sunlight. Pleasantdale Estates. Beneath the community name, instead of any individual's title, was a simple phrase, a community, not a kingdom. Raymond had proposed the slogan at the first board meeting after his election. It passed unanimously. Residents began gathering to watch the installation, drawn by curiosity and the sense that something meaningful was happening. Margaret Fielding arrived in her motorized wheelchair, the same woman whose cat had been killed by Bryce Whitmore a year earlier. She had testified at his sentencing hearing, describing the terror she had lived with for months afterward. Now she smiled as she watched the new sign being secured into place. It's beautiful, she said softly. It feels like we finally got our neighborhood back. Kevin Marsh, the young man who had provided the 37th signature on the audit petition, stood nearby with his wife and infant daughter. He caught my eye and nodded, a simple acknowledgement that needed no words. We had done something together that none of us could have done alone. The ceremony, if it could be called that, was brief and informal. Raymond said a few words about new beginnings and community trust. Several residents applauded. Someone had brought coffee and pastries. For the first time since I had moved to Pleasantdale, the atmosphere felt genuinely welcoming. No undercurrent of fear, no sideways glances toward Sandra Whitmore's house at the end of the block. Her house had been sold 3 months earlier to pay legal fees and restitution, purchased by a young family who had no idea about its history. I hoped they would never need to learn. After the crowd dispersed, I walked home along the same route I had taken hundreds of times over the past months, past Raymond's house, where the curtains were now open instead of perpetually drawn, past the spot where Bryce had stood beneath the streetlight, recording my darkened windows, past the driveway where he had slashed my tires, an act of arrogance that had sealed his own fate. The replacement tires had been paid for by court-ordered restitution, along with the cost of the generator and security equipment I had purchased. Every dollar Bryce had cost me came back, plus interest. More importantly, the evidence those systems captured had cost him 4 years of his freedom. I checked my mailbox at the end of my driveway. The same mailbox where I had received 8 fraudulent violation notices on my 4th day in this neighborhood. The total fines from those notices, $1,075, had been refunded 2 months earlier, along with a formal letter of apology from the new HOA board. Inside the mailbox today was a different kind of envelope, a card, hand-addressed, with no return label. I opened it standing in my driveway, just as I had opened that first violation notice almost 7 months ago. The card was simple, featuring a watercolor image of flowers on the front. Inside, in neat handwriting, was a message. Thank you for staying. Thank you for fighting. This neighborhood is better because you are in it. It was signed by 14 different residents, names I recognized from the petition, from the HOA meeting, from the months of quiet support that had sustained me when the outcome was still uncertain. I was still holding the card when a familiar vehicle pulled into my driveway. Diana Cole stepped out, dressed in civilian clothes rather than her uniform, carrying a flat rectangular package under her arm. "Garrett, glad I caught you at home." She handed me the package. This came through official channels, but I wanted to deliver it personally. I unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a framed certificate bearing the county seal, Citizen Commendation for Outstanding Service to Community Safety. Below the formal language was a handwritten note from the county sheriff. Your work in Pleasantdale demonstrates that justice is not about authority. It is about evidence, patience, and the courage to stand alone until others find their courage too. Well done. Diana stayed for coffee. We sat on my porch, watching the neighborhood go about its Saturday routines. Children riding bicycles, couples walking dogs, a postal worker making deliveries without fear of being reported for imaginary violations. "You know," Diana said, "when you first called me about Bryce Whitmore, I wasn't sure what you were getting into. I've seen cases like this before. Usually the person fighting back gets exhausted and gives up." She sipped her coffee. "But you documented everything. You followed the procedure. You let them make mistakes and captured every single one." She paused. "That's how justice is supposed to work." After she left, I sat alone on my porch as the afternoon sun stretched shadows across my lawn. I had come to Pleasantdale looking for peace after 22 years of fighting other people's battles. Instead, I had found one more battle that needed fighting. But this time, the outcome had been different. Not because I had power or authority, but because I had patience and evidence and neighbors who were waiting for someone to stand up first. The 37 signatures that launched the audit petition were now framed and hanging in the community center lobby, a reminder that collective courage can dismantle even the most entrenched corruption. I looked at the card in my hand, at the 14 signatures of people who had thanked me for staying. I thought about Doug Mercer, who had tried to fight alone and lost, about the 5 families who had fled before him, about Margaret Fielding's cat, and Harold Finch's 6 years of silence. They had all been waiting for something to change. Sometimes, change requires nothing more than one person who refuses to leave. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that patience and evidence and courage can overcome corruption, then you understand what Karma Fence is all about. Justice is not always swift, but it is always possible when good people refuse to be silent. Subscribe to Karma Fence and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story of ordinary people standing up against those who abuse their power. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that fighting back is worth it. And remember, the fence of karma catches everyone eventually. Those who build walls of corruption will one day find those walls closing in around them. Thank you for watching until the end. Until next time, stay strong and stay